Hey guys, today I want to take a look at the next Muraddad game that I've played recently. This is again against Peon, who's #1 champion of the Muraddad. So, game starts off about like what we've seen before. You see the Muraddad, and then I'm playing my line with pawn to e4, and I get the first hand up to e3. In the first set of videos, we covered some of what happens when black plays for d5 and white plays for f4. Then we had my last set of videos where we saw black playing pawn to e5. In this one, Peon goes for another approach, and he plays for pawn to c5 with the idea of b6 and bringing the first hand to c6. So I wanted to have something interesting to play against this approach, and what I tried here is pawn to c4. So the idea with pawn to c4 is I'm basically turning this into a kind of Botvinnik English, where I'm going to play knight c3, rook b1, pawn to b4. I think it's an interesting approach. In terms of, how should black handle this? Well, if black plays for a symmetrical structure, I think then we're going to see white getting a big advantage in this line, because I'm going to have this idea of b4, and I am going to be the one with the pawn breaks, b4 and f4, and black's knights are not well positioned here to support the f5 break. It can kind of support the b5 break, but I'm going to be first on the Shah side anyway. So I don't think a symmetrical approach works. Peon went for a bit more of a defensive approach. He plays fc6, knight c3, b6, rook b1, b5. I play b4, and then he went for b5 himself. But as you'll see, the fact that I arrived on the Shah side first due to my time advantage. Remember, white always is going to have a bit of a time advantage because the Muraddad involves so many knight moves. So because of my time advantage, I was able to create a weakness with takes, and yeah, here I just played knight e2, taking advantage of the fact that b pawn is pinned. But this c5 pawn is going to become weak. So in terms of what are other approaches for black, pawn to d5 is a possibility. The idea of black maybe trying to play for pawn to d4. My idea there was to play knight e2, so that on d4 I'm able to simply sacrifice the first hand for the two pawns, and I have a very big center. But a very interesting line here would be knight to e5. And then I play pawn to f4, and then black might steer back and play knight to c6 again. So black will be able to force through the move d4 here. In some sense, this isn't really in the spirit of the Muraddad, because black has now moved to knight so many times, but on the other hand, often in the Muraddad, black not only moves the knights here and here, but then continues to move them many more times. So I think this is interesting, and we probably would see a line like takes, knight d2, with the idea of coming up to f3 to again control this square maybe. And now here maybe black plays d4, forces white back, and black can maybe just continue with normal development. So for instance, maybe maybe b6 first, bishop a6, bishop d6, and just trying to play with a space advantage. So that's not to say that this position is quite so simple for black. For instance, I think maybe the sacrifice bishop e3 here, with the idea of sacrificing again on c5, is going to force d takes. At some point, it might not be now, but like let's say And if black tries to play here to defend, white's going to continue to put pressure on it. And it's at some point, if takes, then white will be able to play f takes and create a big center after that elephant sacrifice. So, I'm not sure that the position is easy to play. I think there's a lot of chances for both sides, but I think that probably the right way for black to play is to try something dynamic with d5, because what ends up happening in the game was a typical defensive try, but it was just too passive. So here's what we saw in the game. Note that it might be possible black could play c takes, a takes first, and then pawn to b5, and that might be an improvement. There's a lot of ways for white to play here. One would be c5, which is something that we would actually see in a lot of the Mujana type openings. I'm not crazy about this because I think having the first hand on c6 helps black in the lines where d takes, b4 happens. Because black's probably going to play knight a6 to be able to hold this pawn, and maybe the first hand comes out to b5 at some point. That being said, black isn't threatening to play b takes because of the pressure, so it's possible maybe white can just continue with d4 here, play bishop d3, knight e2. So there would be a lot of work to be done in this position because it's very sharp. Instead of c5, and also just continue development with knight e2. The idea would be to come to d4 at some point. If b takes, d takes, white certainly is going to get a big space advantage here. And the question of exactly who's better is just going to come down to a lot of concrete play. So for instance, knight a6, maybe it's met by b5. So the b5 move maybe is a threat because c5 isn't so much of a weakness. Bishop's coming out to a3. So and then lastly on b5, I can play takes, knight takes, takes, maybe first hand takes, and then just continue with fairly normal play, knight e2, knight c3, try to put some pressure. But here I have a good sense that black would be able to equalize because this doesn't look particularly threatening. Another thing to consider is that after c takes, a takes isn't forced. Rook takes is also possible. I think it's kind of just a very interesting idea. The idea is just actually to try to get a little more firepower and try to prevent the b5 move. So b5, c takes. And then if first hand takes, then a4, taking advantage of this pin. Although, and the idea is knight a6 to protect this, and then rook takes. So I think you see knight takes, and the idea is to play knight takes c3 with check. And then we might see king c2 to defend the knight and get out of the checks, king c7, then probably knight e2. And I think white has a tiny bit of an advantage here, just due to a little bit of extra space and flexibility. But this is probably a pretty small advantage. And I guess b5 wouldn't have to be met by c takes. and maybe white is going to be able to come up with something else that's a little more convincing. But the black idea is to play knight a6 to defend the rook, hit white's rook, and then play b takes. So there's a lot of different ideas here. I think leading with c takes b4 makes sense, rather than playing b5. Also, pawn to d5. Well, pawn to d5 probably doesn't work because b takes and d takes. Probably c takes here, threatening the knight. A takes, d takes. Black sacrificed a pawn, but his idea is to play, like knight d6 or bishop a6 and try to hit this pawn and get it back. But there's going to be some concrete lines like knight d6, pawn to c5, and that's going to be a problem for the rook. Maybe black has to lead with knight to a6, but now even if black gets his pawn back, white is hopefully going to have gained some time out of this. And the pawn on a3 is easier to defend than the pawn on b6. So white should be able to claim a small advantage there. But here, after b takes, I just play knight e2. As white, I'm not worried about b4 since I can just play knight a4, and this pawn is in a lot of trouble. With knight g2, I'm just getting ready to start some exchanges on b5, and then I'm going to play for an endgame where this c5 pawn is weak. And of course, black can't take because the rook is hanging. So knight g2, bishop d6. The point of this move is to defend the rook on b8. But so now I'm able to initiate this sequence to try to exchange off some pieces and isolate the c5 pawn. I play king c2 just to stop this from being with check when black takes. On c3, if I play knight to a4 to try to hit the c5 pawn, black probably counters with this incredible idea, knight e5, hitting the f3 pawn, so I play f4, and then knight d7. And this at least is temporarily holding the pawn. This is still going to be a long-term weakness, but black has at least managed to preserve his position for a little while. And he's going to play king e7, rook d8, bishop a6, and then try to sacrifice the pawn at some point to create good counterplay. I can, of course, also take knight takes e5, knight takes f3, and play pawn to d4, followed by bishop d3. And so after like king e7, bishop d3, knight c7, rook takes, maybe something like rook f1, knight g5. White has a small advantage here, just thanks to a nice center and a good outpost on c5. But it's pretty far from winning. Black has a very, very good defensive structure with knight to f7 and the knight coming back to d6. So that's nothing special for white. So instead of knight to a4, I play king c2, king to c7, and now I play knight takes b5 check. So I have a very specific idea of removing some pieces, playing a4 and bishop a3 to attack the c5 pawn. I can also, of course, still play knight a4, and the idea is roughly the same, knight e5, f4, knight d7. And maybe this is a little bit improved version for white over the last time because the king on c7 will be vulnerable when white puts a rook on the c file, whereas the king would have been safer on e7. All right, I will be back. Okay, and we're back. So I want to just finish up the explanation of this game here. All right, let's see, where were we? We had gotten about as far as my plan on the Shah side here. Broken through, made a weakness on c5. Um, okay, and I head into this endgame. Um, and I'll show you the way that I end up converting this advantage against the c5 pawn. So black plays king to b6, which is pretty logical, trying to hold the pawn. But eventually, the king is going to end up having some trouble along the b file, particularly when I play a4. Um, but here I make an inaccuracy. So the best approach for me is to simply go ahead with pawn to a4. The first hand goes back, and now I play bishop to h3. And then, black will play a move, maybe something uh, like elephant h6, and then I just bring the elephant out to h3, and I'm threatening rook b1 check and to grab the pawn on c5. Instead, I play the right plan, but with a wrong move order, and I lead with bishop. Um, in this case, instead of leading with pawn to a4, I lead with bishop h3. And this allows a very surprising shot. Black can play knight g5, which is what Peon did, and it forks the f3 and the h3 points. Now, as the saying goes, it's only an elephant, so I just give it up. I just play f4. It's much better for me to play f4 and then sideline this knight, which doesn't have an easy re-entry into the game, and and I keep this pawn. That's going to be much more important to me than, say, if I retreat the elephant and then I give up the very important f3 pawn. If I give up this pawn, then the black knight will sit very pretty on e5. And suddenly I'm in a much worse position, and I'll be the one trying to make a draw. So knight g5 is something I missed, but I react correctly. I play f4, and here Peon actually ended up going knight to f7. Um, this is a little bit surprising move, and I think this move ultimately costs black the game, because black has come this far, but what he's saying is that it was a bluff, and he was never going to play knight takes h3. So of course the knight will be trapped, but white does not have a way to actually go about capturing the knight. The closest thing he could do to that would be sometime in the endgame, maybe play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves with his king. But of course there's not time for that kind of thing now. Black would, be able to fish the knight out somehow, depending on which way he went. So my plan on knight takes h3 would be to just continue with my plan and play bishop a3. And black is not going to easily be able to prevent rook to b1 and grabbing the pawn on c5. So I would just end up playing basically down this elephant on h3 for the pawn. And it's a very slight material disadvantage for white, but I have a lot of other benefits, like I'll be able to attack the pawn on a7, so I wasn't really worried about it. In terms of what black can do in this position, though, he wants to get the knight out, so it would be really interesting to see what happens on e5. This is threatening to take twice on f4 because of the bishop on d6, so white could just play, for instance, rook b1 check, probably like king c7. And here white could just play something like pawn to f5 with the idea of taking next. But this doesn't look particularly dangerous for black. He'll probably be able to play g6, put pressure here, and the knight can be rerouted. So, white will want to come up with a different approach, and probably he'll play f takes, rook f1, with the idea of coming into f7. And well, here though, maybe black can play. Black can probably play rook f8 and take the rooks off. Yeah, I'm not seeing any reason not to do that. And then of course another way to defend the f7 square would be to play knight g5, get the knight out, and come back. So it might be possible to play rook f1 first. The idea being if e takes f, then g takes, and white is sort of threatening to continue to harass this knight. When it goes to g1, there'll be rook g3, pick up the g7 point. So you might see like bishop takes, Ferdinand takes, still some play on this knight. Maybe here g6. The idea of continuing this kind of campaign. Oh, although rook g3 I guess this ends up trapping the knight because e2 is covered. So yeah, black would have to be pretty careful here. So rook f1 looks like a good move. Maybe black plays rook to f8. And maybe the game kind of continues along these lines. Black probably is going to do something to try to fish this knight out, like g6, g5. So it's not really clear. This would lead to a very unclear position. And it gives black some chances, because he'll win some material. As it was in the game after knight to f7, here I had a pretty clear route for the rest of the game. I just play a4, Ferdinand goes to c6, and bishop a3. I'm just going to play rook b1 and pick up the c5 pawn. And there's not really a good response for black. He plays bishop b4, which is a good try because it does gum up the works, but I just play rook b1 anyway. And now my threat is simply to play pawn to d4 and take on c5, because c takes will be met with rook takes b4 check, followed by rook takes d4. So the black king ends up being very exposed out here, and there's no way for black to really hold this position together. So bishop a6, now I just play pawn to d4. It's also possible to play takes d4 first, with the idea of, okay, king back, we play rook takes b4. I did not play this in the game because I thought king to c4 would hold. But amazingly, white actually has a way to give checkmate here. So you notice that the king is hemmed in, the pawn controls the pawns control all these squares, and the other squares here are controlled by the white king. b4 is controlled by the rook. So black's king actually steps into a mating net here. During the game, I just didn't find it. I was thinking, okay, well, this elephant, it can't come back and help. There's no way to help. So I didn't find this mating net, but the idea is knight to d, threatening knight to b2 mate. And of course, the way for black to counter this is to open up the b4 square for his king. So you could play, for instance, bishop d6, with the idea of, knight b4, or knight b2, king b4. And so it looks like white's not making any progress there. But amazingly here, white can simply continue with a mating net by playing rook to b3, so that the knight comes in from behind, and the b4 square is covered by the rook. So amazingly, there's nothing that black can do here to avoid knight b2 checkmate. So I did not see that way to proceed in the game. If I had seen it, I probably would have just played bishop takes immediately. But instead I play pawn to d4, which is fine. This is another route. Black plays c takes, and now I have rook b4 check, king a5, and then rook takes d4. The disadvantage of this compared to the last line is black does have rook d8 just to try to hold his position together. He's saying, hey, I'm down an elephant, but I'll probably be able to draw in the endgame. And here I just play bishop c5 with the idea to pick off the pawn on a7. And in terms of other ways to go, I can also play rook takes, king b3, and I'm just holding everything really well. Bishop c5 is probably coming next. Maybe black has to play knight b7 to try to prevent that, but then Furzian centralizes. And I have a better Furzian along with the extra elephant. So good endgame, not entirely won already for white. A lot of those endgames end up being kind of drawish. So that's why I didn't go into it. I thought, well, it looks like a kind of drawish opposite colored Furzian endgame, so I thought maybe I'd try to pick off the a7 pawn directly. And we see rook takes, and then here black tries a very aggressive king b4 with the idea of coming king c4 next. Black would be better off trying to just hold with king to b6. This does look like a very good endgame for white. e5 is coming, so I either have to play e5 myself, which I don't like because that would give this Furzian an outpost, or I just play bishop to e3 with the idea of bringing the Furzian up to c5 next. White has a very, very good position and good chances to win that endgame. But instead, black played king to b4, trying for this more aggressive chance. So I just pick off the a7 pawn. And then black plays king c4, which is his plan. But here, amazingly, white has mate in 3. So same theme as before, this king is going to end up in a mating net. So I need to cover the b4 square. So I play Furzian to c5. And here there is absolutely nothing that black can do to prevent one of these checkmates from happening. So it's actually mate in 3. Black plays e5, and here I just play knight to d1. And I have threats of checkmate on the e3 and b2 squares. Nothing black can do, so black resigned. Taking the pawn would prevent this checkmate, but then knight b2 is also checkmate. So this was the next game in this series of games I'm playing with Peon and the Muraddad. Just to sum up, I think this approach with c5 is an interesting one. We've covered d5, we've covered e5, so the c5, b6, fc6 approach is kind of the logical next one for Peon to try. And then my move c4, going for a Botvinnik English structure with knight c3, rook b1, and b4 is very interesting, and I think has some good chances for white because white is going to be up so much time in getting his b4 push in. And I think that if black wants to try to complicate things, he should probably play d5 here with the idea of knight e2, preventing d4, knight e5 to hit the f pawn. And here after pawn to f4, play knight c6 with the idea of really reinforcing that pawn to e5 move, or pawn to d4 move, followed by e6, e5, for instance, just to try to create a big center for black. So I think there's going to be a lot of complications here, and I think there are a lot of really interesting lines for both sides. And one potential thing to note is that maybe this possibility of pawn to e5 means white should be a little careful about how soon he plays the g3 move. If the pawn had been left back on g2, then the knight e5 resource wouldn't be nearly as good because it wouldn't hit anything on the f3 square. Okay, thank you guys for watching.